Welcome to the Arena Decklist Podcast. I'm Jerry Thompson, joined as always by Brian Gottlieb, and I didn't want to talk about this. I really didn't, but I think that because it was all over the Twitter discourse today that we kind of have to, and Brian is making me, and that's who I'm going to blame it on.
That's kind of the general flow of the show lately, is that I drag you to the table and make you talk about something you don't want to talk about every week. I'm glad this has become a real painful experience for you to sit down and do the podcast every week.
You gotta start trends somehow, you know? It starts with one, then it goes to two. I mean...
Right, so pretty soon we're just going to transition to a format of just things you don't want to talk about. That's going to be the entirety of the cast.
Stuff that Brian makes me talk about. The thing that we're talking about that I don't want to talk about is this news announcement titled Magic's Voyages to Universes Beyond, which is an official announcement from Wizards of the Coast. And the front half of the announcement is basically talking about how certain IPs such as The Lord of the Rings and Warhammer 40K are going to be printed as Magic sets. You know, if we go to Innistrad, well, now we're going to Middle Earth.
Good summation. There is more to it than that, though, right? Like
there's a lot.
There's some complications and interesting stuff happening with this. But the broad 100-foot view is that we're going to different... Are they planes? I don't even know if they're planes. We're going to different places with Magic design. We're going to touch on a bunch of different IPs. Walking Dead was just the tip of the iceberg. This should surprise absolutely nobody, right? Like we saw the Godzilla stuff. We saw the Walking Dead stuff. Walking Dead, I believe, was the best-selling secret lair of all time.
Oh, come on.
So this was just going to keep happening and keep evolving. So zero surprise in this announcement.
It's messed up because the Walking Dead is kind of like Nickelback at this point. You know, like it was cool for a little bit, and now just basically anyone who I interact with is just like, oh yeah, that show sucks. Like, how dare you watch that show or whatever? Like everyone is just too cool and has moved past it, yet it is the highest selling secret lair of all time. Some of that is FOMO for sure, because it's limited and potentially good for Commander, and that was the main gripe, right? Was that you have these things that are potentially like very powerful and format warping and only available at a select time to a select few. And then there's stuff like Rick showing up in Legacy Humans or whatever. So I understand if people were like, oh, I better get this. And, you know, I don't want to regret not getting it or having to pay like $200 for a Rick somewhere down the line. So I get it.
The sentence having to pay $200 for a Rick is very strange. I like that it's part of what we have to discuss now. Nickelback isn't that bad, dude. This is going to be a really controversial part of the podcast. And I'm not trying to argue that they are a good band. Certainly their lyrics are some of the dumbest I've ever heard, but like they're competent musicians that put out like songs that a bunch of people like. I never understood why they became like the poster child of just awful music. There's way worse bands out there than Nickelback.
It's just one of the original memes, right? I mean,
I guess so, yeah.
Are you sure you don't want to save this for next week on the podcast where you make me talk about something I don't want to talk about?
We just go over the Nickelback discography for like the entire show.
Oh my God.
Song by song, we'll discuss all of Nickelback's greatest hits. No, I'm not trying to make a case that I like them. It's just like, it is a meme. You're exactly right. It's one of those things that caught momentum and then it kind of spins up on itself. But that's what happens here a lot of the time, right? Like all Magic announcements are momentum based.
Yes. Let's circle back to music at least. I don't think that Nickelback is a heinous band, but I think that there are a lot of strikes against them, like you noted the lyrics. And I think that there's a few different types of musicians who get into it, and like certainly that evolves over time, right? It's like you want to make music because you like making music, and you want to make music like for yourself and for expression and whatever. Mm-hmm. And then someone like Nickelback comes along, and it's like it's very clear that they are trying to get on the radio and make money being musicians.
But to me, that's not a fault. Like there is,
I know
there's beauty in like making a song that a bunch of people like, and
pop music is entirely that.
Right. And I don't think like you can disqualify them as musicians because clearly they are competent. And anyone who, you know, studies songwriting to the extent that they do, I mean, maybe it's like natural that they have this ability to tap into the broader collective want for a type of music. And that's a talent in and of itself. So it's like, they're obviously accomplished musicians. They've obviously dedicated their life to music. I am positive these people love music. Like, they don't go home and sit in silence, and they have their influences, and most of their lives have been built around music. And it's so easy to see them as like this monolith, this thing designed to just get money and exploit the recording industry. But like, there's people behind that too, who are just musicians who happen to be good at making catchy, stupid songs that a lot of people like.
Right. And I think that the difference is like, it's cool if you sit down to write a song and someone hears that song and they're like, oh, that's really good. And then if your goal is to sit down and just brainworm someone, that's less respectable, you know?
Yeah.
But it still takes talent. Obviously, it takes talent. It's just a different kind of talent.
Yeah. I look, I don't know the people from Nickelback. I don't know when they sit down to write songs if they are trying to say, let's produce a hit, or I just like this song. I like the way this sounds. This is pleasing to me, and I want to make it. No idea what their process is like. But I could see how, as a musician, and I'm not a particularly accomplished musician, but I have played music my entire life. I play a bunch of instruments. I've even recorded like demos. Don't look for them. You can't find them, and I'm never giving them to you.
Yo,
but no,
hook it up.
Not happening.
Hook it up. This is going to be the Uber Patreon tier reward.
Maybe that's
Bryan
how we
will just play music to you.
Yeah, but like, the process, it's very easy for me to see how it could become just something that is pleasing to a bunch of people. And like, someone hears your song and they're like, oh, I really like that. And then you go, okay, people respond to this. And you just continue to go down that rabbit hole, and your sensibilities get shaped in that way. And all of a sudden you're just like a mega pop star. And I think it catches a lot of people by surprise. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that's the case, if that's what's happening in the case of Nickelback as well. Honestly,
man, if Papa Roach had like one or two more commercial successes, they could have been Nickelback.
Maybe. They certainly wrote like catchy new metal songs that a lot of people liked. And you look back on it, it all sounds, that's the thing, is like, you look back on most music and not a lot of it holds up. Like, a lot of it is always going to be a product of the moment. And then there's obviously timeless things that you can listen to forever. But if you look at a genre, especially when it comes to pop, like, listen to some 90s pop now, and it is very hard to enjoy in any kind of serious fashion. And I think the evolution of music is always going to be such that these things sound a little stupid. And a lot of music sounds really stupid. And just because you're not timeless doesn't disqualify you as a musician.
Yeah, I guess that is another way to describe what I was talking about before, where it's like there's two types of musicians, right? Like, one, I think the first one is like sitting down to record a song that will hopefully be timeless. Mm-hmm. And the other one is very much trying to capture the moment and, maybe have like some lyrics that are very time appropriate and kind of like allows the song, even if it's not like as catchy or as good, will endear itself to the person who's listening to it because they connect with it or something. But yeah, like different skill sets.
It's kind of like, if you think about it, and I'm not a huge modern art fan, like, I've tried and I've gone to a bunch of like modern art galleries, and it just doesn't really click with me. I guess I'm too simple for it, but it's this distinction between modern art and like the classic masters, where you look at something painted by a traditional painter and you can just go, oh yeah, this is beautiful. Like, the talent required to produce this is incredible. Look at how they have produced this incredible landscape, and the subject is captured so well. And then you look at modern art and it's like a ball of sugar with a bunch of sweetener packets wrapped around it. And that's from somewhere. Maybe The Simpsons did it, but you get the point. Like, it's not inherently beautiful, but like, there's something there. There's a statement to be made, and they're two very different skill sets, but I think most people would accept that there's talent in both.
Yes. All right. Off of music, off of art, back to Lord of the Rings and whatnot. So there's also this D&D set coming out that is not part of this, and the D&D set is just in place of a core set, effectively, or is a core set.
Yep.
And the difference between that and the Voyages to Universes Beyond is that these are basically supplemental sets. Like, they're kind of taking the release schedule from the master stuff that they supposedly shit canned. So these are not going to be standard legal, which makes me like less upset about the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's good. I think it's good that they're not standard legal.
I just am not very upset about this in general. That's kind of where I fall on it. It feels to me like it was an inevitability, and this falls squarely under the stuff that I look at as not for me, but like it's going to matter to a bunch of people, and it's going to bring more people to the game. And if you're not degrading standards so you can fit Rick Steadfast Leader into it, then I'm mostly for it.
You remember the whole? You remember the whole card name?
Yeah, well, I just wrote about it in my, I guess it was my article. It was my fact or fiction response this week on Star City. So okay. I had to look up the full name.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah.
So I'm not like upset. I'm not like, oh, quit Magic, blah, blah, blah. I should honestly just go through and read the text messages that I sent to Nick Prince today, because we were talking about this a little bit. But so like Nick's point on Twitter was that Magic has been doing these sorts of things for a very long time. His examples were like Swords to Plowshares, and I don't know. They're like I don't know if he brought these up or if they were just in the comments, but just like Arabian Nights, Presence of the Master has Einstein on it. Even stuff like Innistrad and Theros, like these are like cribbed versions of other mythologies or universes or whatever, right? So the difference to me is that it's one thing to be like, okay, this is Magic's version of Zeus, and this is literally a card named Rick and has a picture of Rick on it, you know? Regardless, like, it doesn't change my experience with Magic. I think that despite the art for Magic making me interested in it, now if like the cards were like their names were all just numbers and they didn't have art, I would still just happily play the game.
Right.
So I don't really care about all of this. I think it's better that these things aren't in standard, because there are people who are going to, look at it the same way as I do, but feel more strongly about it. And I think when you're kind of like forcing that upon someone, then it's less good. And if people want to engage with it, they certainly have the option to. And I think that these sets are going to sell well, regardless of being in standard or not. At least Lord of the Rings. I think Lord of the Rings is going to do well. I know that Warhammer 40K is big, but I don't know, how many of those people actually want to try and play Magic or something. So
it seems to me like that's a good spot for crossover value. Like those are very high investment strategy gamers, and they're certainly going to be open to the idea of buying a bunch of Magic cards and, spending thousands of dollars. So I understand targeting Warhammer specifically, even if it doesn't have the broad appeal of something like Lord of the Rings.
To be fair, I think there's maybe a split between people who like painting miniatures and playing strategy games.
Okay. I don't know enough about the space to comment on that. So that's fine. I'm not sure how exactly their world is founded and how much of what percentage is what. So I'll reserve comment on that. I want to point something out, though. This is technically premium content. Don't tell Cedric. But this is what I wrote in my Fact or Fiction this week about why I am not excited for Strixhaven. And I said, what I've seen of this world so far feels extremely derivative of an already derivative fantasy world. For the most part, Magic deals in tropes, and that vibe has always worked for it. But this feels a little less like Delver of Secrets, winking and nodding towards the fly, and a little more like Rick's Steadfast Leader. So when it comes...
So we agree on that there is a distinct difference between derivative and like literal carbon copy, right?
Yes. And in my opinion, Strixhaven started to feel like it's drifting too far towards the this is just Harry Potter again side of the spectrum. And if you told me that this was like planned to be the Harry Potter set for
and they just couldn't get the license,
yeah, I would believe you. Like that makes sense. There's a lot of similarities going on here. And for my core Magic worlds, I like the idea of winking and nodding. I think the tropes have always worked well for Magic, and they went harder in the past. Like Arabian Nights is less a trope and more, this is Arabian Nights. These are things from this mythology.
Right.
The evolution to wink and nod as opposed to state, I think has been cool for Magic and has made it feel like its own unique world. But if these things are just like outside explorations, and I don't spend all my time when I'm sitting down to a Magic tournament, whenever we can do that again, staring at Rick across the table from me or getting beat up by Gandalf, then I think they're fine and fun and cool, and a lot of people will like them. And for as much as I was anti The Walking Dead, it was never really about the production of other IPs. It was that specific IP and how little it had to do with Magic's space and how discordant it felt from everything else in Magic's world to have a stupid baseball bat be the equipment. Like,
Yep.
it just didn't track. But this stuff tracks. This makes more sense to me. So if there's more things like this, go for it. I want more people to play Magic. I want more people to have fun with Magic. And I'm not all that upset about this.
One of the things that I am kind of disappointed in is that I bring this game up a decent amount, but like the lore in Genshin Impact is actually really, really good. Mm-hmm. And they've released 2 of the 7 or 8 continents that they're going to have, or like not continents, but like, big towns, big areas. And you only have like partial history of the lore for like the 2 that you're in, and the story of the main game is not finished. But it's like the storytelling that they do and their character development and the way that they drop like subtle hints through various like quests or on item flavor text or whatever for you to piece all together is rad.
Yeah.
And I want Magic to do that well. I think that they have the capability of doing that well. But instead, Magic's lore is just very tropey and falls flat. And I think a lot of it is because they're just like, well, let's do, Theros and Innistrad or this D&D set. And they try and figure out ways to create like, Harry Potter world and then drop Jace in it versus like, okay, what is going on with Jace in this multiverse or whatever. And I don't know. I'm just disappointed in that because I think that Magic definitely could hook me on lore. And obviously there are certain, like pieces of the story or whatever that are very, very well done. I don't want to say that, just blanket, it's all bad because it's certainly not. But I think that it could be so much better. And this kind of gets in the way of it, just them doing these derivative worlds rather than just focusing on creating their own thing.
One of the things that struck me during my time with Genshin Impact, which I don't really play anymore, but did appreciate and thought it was quite good when I did play it, there's just a sense that a tremendous number of people had to work on this game because there was so much depth to the lore and so much just written content and such beautiful cutscenes, and the world itself was so large and the interactions were so good. And you just had this feeling that like, wow, they dumped a ton of money into this, had a ton of staff, and were willing to take that gamble to create something really special. And the impression I get from the Magic content creation space is that it's a pretty small group and they see it as kind of an ancillary part of their product and not the most important thing a lot of the times.
Yeah.
And you can fix a lot of problems by throwing money at that and just having a huge staff producing this stuff.
To be fair, the play design team is also very small and they're a core part of Magic's success. So.
Yeah. So, that's exactly the point is that, and I don't know how like the dollars drawn by Genshin Impact compared to the dollars drawn by Magic, but comparable would be my guess, if not in Magic's favor. I don't know that, so maybe I shouldn't even speculate. But I know Genshin Impact does very well. It made a lot of money very quickly, but so does Magic. So you'd certainly like to see more investment in the infrastructure and more people producing these things. I think how you get the better products like Genshin Impact has. Because you spend any time with that game, it's the immediate sense is that, wow, this took a ton of effort and a lot of people working towards the goal.
Yeah. I mean, even if you don't like the characters or the gameplay or the gacha system or whatever, like I think that you can still appreciate that aspect of it, certainly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yeah, with Magic, it's like you get that like thrill some of the time, and I think a lot of the time it happens with the stories that were written on the website before. Like I definitely read a lot of them, probably not all of them, but it just doesn't translate the same way. And it's like a thing that seems to be created like after the fact rather than,
right.
This is the thing that's driving it. It's like, oh, we want to go to this world. Okay, we'll like now make a story about it rather like, where is the story going to take us?
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting distinction. Letting the narrative drive the plane as opposed to the plane drive the narrative, which I don't know this, but that seems to be the way we do this is that we want to do this thing. So let's figure out how to do it. And I think the Gatewatch characters made that problem worse. I think they felt very shoehorned, and I'm super happy we got away from that. But it's funny, that's when I think a little bit more effort was being invested into the story.
Yeah, exactly.
And it didn't work for me still. Like that was not what I was looking for. And I guess under those guidelines, it's like, well, why did we invest in this? It didn't work. It didn't really hit a home run. So, and we're selling more Magic cards now. So let's just go to Lord of the Rings world and let's go to Warhammer world. And it doesn't really matter all that much. And I can't really fault them for reaching that conclusion. I just wish a different conclusion was reached.
Same. I will note that if anyone has like a huge issue with this, you should probably think about why that is, because you probably shouldn't. Other people are going to like this. That's cool. I'm super happy for all of the Lord of the Rings fans out there who, made like imager dumps off like Magic Card Editor with like all of their Lord of the Rings characters and stuff. And like, this is the thing that they've wanted their entire life, right? Is like this mashup between the two things that they love. And I think that is awesome. And you can just let people like things. I think that's cool. If you think that this is going to be like money grabbing sort of thing, then your problems with capitalism, really, not with like this set. So.
Yeah, that's where I usually fall on this kind of stuff. Is maybe it irks me a little bit. Maybe I don't love it, but like we all got to make money. I do things I don't like to make money. I spent the vast majority of my life doing things that made me miserable just so I could survive and make enough money to get by. So it's a frustrating system, but it is what it is. And these cards are going to be fine. They'll exist. You'll see them rarely, probably. Almost never is my guess, unless you're like a dedicated Commander player, unless you like them and you want them to be part of your experience. I have a feeling like playgroups will feel similarly over these things. Your regular Commander set is either going to like these or not, and the opinion's probably going to propagate through everyone. And I hope no Commander playgroups are going to split up because someone wants to play with Lord of the Rings and someone doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Walking Dead stuff was like, because it was limited release, potentially very expensive, stuff like that. Like, I could understand wanting to ban it if it was also like very powerful. Like, what if Lotus was legal in everything, but only less than 1% of the player base could have them, right? It's like, well, that's just kind of silly. I don't think that those cards are up there power level wise, but I think that it sets a bad precedent. And I don't think that these are going to be like this. Like, these are almost certainly just going to be like print to demand. If people keep buying them, then they'll keep making them. So I don't think it's going to have that issue. So I would imagine that people are going to be okay with it. Maybe it's going to feel weird to get attacked by a Gandalf or whatever, but you'll get over it.
I think we may have done this question before. Do you have a secret layer that would just like put you over the moon on this idea? Maybe not a secret layer. Do you have a universe beyond that you would just be like, yes, 100% in, can't wait?
This is sort of how Nick and I's conversation started. Was he messaged me asking if he asked me like a specific example, but like if I liked the crossover things in general. He was like, specific thing, would you be offended? And I was like, well, yes, but I don't really like these crossovers. And unless it's like, this is the shtick, this is what we do, is like, I don't know, for Magic's thing, it is the multiverse, right? They have multiple planes. And if they wanted to put D&D in the same universe, then they could do that. And I suppose that would be fine, but I mostly stay away from IPs like that because I don't like that concept. Where it's just like, well, we can just kind of get whatever we want in here. The rules don't apply, like a bunch of Deus Ex Machina stuff. So I'm just kind of off those in general. And like, that's sort of a reason why I'm not really into Magic's lore. But there's even if they did like secret lair for like a thing that I liked and it was well done, I just would not care because I have no interest. Like, Magic is Magic to me, and the other things I like are the other things. And I can't imagine wanting those things to like exist in Magic or on Magic cards, or like, oh, I want to play like this deck with this weird other fictional character from this other IP in a tournament or whatever. It's just like, no, that stuff doesn't grab me at all.
Yeah, I keep like searching my brain for the things I'm really into and trying to find one that would inspire excitement if it showed up. I haven't found it yet. I hope there is one, and I hope they make it. Like, I hope they just find one where I'm like, yes, this is what I've been looking for. But if you ask me to come up with one, nothing springs to mind immediately. I think for a lot of the same reasons you said.
I know that I'm weird in a lot of the distinctions I make about things, but yeah, I just feel like Magic is Magic, and I wish that it would focus on its own story, its own lore, and just create its own universe rather than like, oh, you like Lord of the Rings, let's put Lord of the Rings on a Magic card. but I mean, it's definitely going to make money for them, right? So what they should absolutely do stuff that is going to make money for them and allow them to continue making magic, because I love magic, but that sort of stuff is just not for me.
Good way of looking at it. Also, I'm going to out you, but I'll out myself at the same time, so it's not so bad. You are very much a person who, when you sit down to eat, you make sure your food does not touch the other food on the plate. Like, you want your vegetables separate from your thing. No mixing ever. I grew up like that. Like, for whatever reason, I hated when my things were separate, to the point where when my parents were serving me dinner, they just started giving it to me in like 4 separate bowls, because I knew I was such a head case about it and couldn't deal with it. So I'm sure that this is reflective of whatever way we approach these things, where we like to like compartmentalize things, keep them separate, not have things cross over. I've gotten over it with food. Maybe I'll get over it with magic cards as well, and I'll happily cast a Gandalf someday.
I'm not quite as strict about it as I was as a child, and it sounds like your parents loved you, whereas there were people in my family who would just, like, constantly berate me for it. And I mean, they used such excuses as like, well, it all mixes in your stomach anyway. Like, what's the difference? It's like, well, why don't you just stir it all together then? Like, I don't taste it when it's in my stomach, right? That's the difference. I'm not trying to put, gravy on my macaroni and cheese. That's just like not a thing that I'm trying to do, right?
Yeah, I had a split, really a split counsel, where my mom would like do all this stuff for me, and my dad would be like, "You're weird. Stop being weird. Just be normal, please." And it was this constant back and forth between one person trying to like enable the weirdness that I had, and one person just being like, "Can I just have a normal child, for the love of God?"
Yeah, it's really not that big of a deal, though.
No, it's not. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah. So again, that's one, like, in addition to let people like things, let people eat food however they want.
Let people have multiple bowls and enjoy their food separately.
Yeah, man. I don't know. I don't get it. I think it is, they're maybe somewhat related. It's just like, this food topping is supposed to go on this food and not on this other one. And like, I don't want to mix them. Like, part of it is because of taste. I just think it like tastes weird. Like, I can eat one thing and then follow it up with another thing. And even if those things like don't mix well and taste well together, like, it's fine, right? Like, that's just a normal thing that people do. You don't douse your cheeseburger with fruit punch or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense.
Some people probably do.
Probably.
I'm sure there's some weird YouTube channel where they eat things like that.
Yeah, cheeseburger milkshake or something. I don't know. So yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I'm not going to get mad about it. There's so much other crap happening in the world that you can expend mental energy getting outraged about, and this is probably not one of them.
Yeah, lots of other spots for anger. I'm sure we'll even find more on today's cast as we go through things. We'll find something else to be angry about if we're not going to be angry here.
Oh, let's talk about Standard. Worst format of all time.
No, I'm actually not that mad at Standard right now. I think it's pretty great, actually.
Define great.
Okay. In the context of modern Magic over the last few years, this is one of the better Standards we've seen.
Okay, great. Low bar, super low bar. Lot of different archetypes that are viable.
Yes.
I'll say that. I won't really go beyond that. I mean, the games are okay. The deck building is fun to an extent. I want like some more cards, basically. Like, I want to have a few more options, because I do feel like we're pigeonholed in a lot of stuff where, like, mono red doesn't have great sideboard options, and you're like, oh, I'm going to play this white deck, and that you also don't have a lot of great sideboard options. You're like, well, I just know that Glass Casket is going to be in my deck and whatever. Whereas blue, it's like, what counter spells do you want to play? What sort of card drawing spell do you want to play? Like, things like that. You just have infinite options, right?
How much of this is the lack of options, and how much of this is the quality of the outlier options, where like some things are so good that you just have to do it? Like, for instance, I build a lot of decks and have a very hard time getting away from Edgewall Innkeeper, because it's still a ridiculous Magic card. And even just the adventure creatures in general. Like, why play one spell when 2 spells will do the job? Thank you. I'll take them both. So that is what I feel more than the absence of options. And I'm curious if you feel the same way.
So I think that Innkeeper is one of the last remaining cards that had that issue. It's also just like a very egregious offender, because it means that you need to take 8 to 16 adventure creatures with you. So it just dictates like a huge portion of your deck. However, since call time, I've been able to get away from that a lot more than I used to. And a lot of it is because of the Fertel cards, not necessarily because they have Fertel, but because they're just very strong, like Alrund's Epiphany, Behold the Multiverse, stuff like that. It's like, if I want to build a Temur deck, which I did in the last week, I don't feel beholden to Edgewall Innkeeper if it's not, a thing that I'm leaning on to win in a certain matchup or whatever. Like there are no sacred cows for main deck slots, but there's certainly like a very strict list of like, these are the cards that are playable, full stop.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I don't know, you look at the mono red decks, right? It's like they play Fervent Champion and Fireblade Charger, and yeah, there are some other like pretty bad one drops, and there are some other like pretty bad two drops, but like for the most part, you're kind of locked in. You're just like, nah, if I want to play like 8 2s, like these are kind of the ones that I have to play. If I want to play 8 1s, these are the best ones, et cetera, et cetera. Like you don't have a ton of options in that regard. It's like if you're playing mono red, I mean, probably 40 of your cards are locked in. And that just kind of stinks, especially when it comes to the sideboard stuff where you just don't have a lot of options.
And yet, here's mono red kind of looking like maybe the best deck in standard. I mean, I think that's debatable, but it certainly has a claim. And
it's debatable. It's certainly very good. So like when you're talking about Edgewall, Innkeeper, Lucky Clover, Omnath, it's like, yeah, okay, your deck is kind of pre-built once you decide what you want to do. That's not a bad thing because all your cards are busted. And in the case of mono red, it's not that like your cards are mediocre. They're all like B pluses, but your game plan is so good right now that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at specifically the card Faceless Haven, because I still like, if you present me with the stats of that card, I am still somewhere in the middle on it. But it plays so effectively in the current landscape of Standard and does such a good job just functioning as the mana base addition to these aggressive decks strategy, where like it's basically free because they are monocolored and they don't want to be more than monocolored. They're very happy falling into that line and getting this 4/3 that's just able to do this burst damage. And I don't think we really have like the correct deck to play with it, but especially the 4/3 in conjunction with Alrund's Epiphany has been a card that has blown me away in terms of just being able to produce this burst damage out of nowhere with very little investment from your deck. Like you play a Mutavault in your deck and you expect to at some point get in 2 damage here or there where the coast is clear. You play this card and it just chunks your opponent out of nowhere and can very quickly wrap up the game.
Yeah, this card is really strong. Definitely undervalued it because of how expensive it is. I think I thought that maybe like 3 toughness is not enough for how expensive it is, but it is. It just is.
Bone Crusher Giant defines what is enough, and 3 is the break point that I'm mostly looking at this point.
Yep, for sure. And I mean, there are things that are happening now with like frostbites and whatever, but yeah, there's not a lot of good ways to tag this thing. The black decks tend to be like these 80 card Urian messes, and they do play a lot of removal spells, but they also play a bunch of mana sources and card advantage cards to make Urian actually good, and you have to have like a pretty big end game. So, you're not super consistent as far as drawing your spot removal spell all the time, and you have to use your spot removal spells early and so on. So, I don't know. They need to figure out if there's like a land they can play, like a Field of Ruin, or I don't know if Lithothrone Blight actually turns this thing off or not. Probably does.
It seems like it should, right? What is the text on that card? I just draw my card and be happy with it and don't worry about it.
Enchanted Land loses all land types and abilities. So
that's an interesting one.
Yeah, so things like that. People have to make those concessions to actually break even on this card or against this card, and I don't think we've gotten there yet.
Yeah, I think also the black decks in general, not only do you have to, your removal is already taxed, but there is a bunch of sorcery speed removal, like Blood Chief's Thirst and Binding the Old Gods are almost always 4-ofs in these lists, and neither one of those is going to help you against a Faceless Haven. And it's a problem that as soon as you played against this red deck from the Urian side, you're like, something has to give here. I can't run the setup anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are certainly more lists adding, like they'll have 4 Heartless Acts or whatever, and they're adding like more and more Eliminates. And I've seen some with upwards of 8 copies of like that 2 mana removal. And Faceless Haven is a lot of the reason for that, or even just like Maul of the Skyclaves type of stuff, where it's like, oh, these things hit hard and I need to kill kind of like everything that you play. And you can't really just rely on Extinction Event getting you super far ahead, or even Shadow's Verdict getting you far ahead enough, because the Faceless Haven's going to kill you.
Yeah, the sweepers are very conditional at this moment. There's no like nonsense with Settle the Wreckage or Teferi making your sweepers work at instant speed. You are vulnerable, and that's good. I think it's good for these decks to have vulnerability. And one of the things I've appreciated about the standard is you can actually just attack and do things that feel to me like older forms of Magic, where you pressure a Wrath and look for holes that way, and then you're still able to find the last damage with a haste creature and Faceless Haven. That feels like classic Magic to me, and I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I agree. So we're going to talk about a couple of standard challenges that happened on Magic Online. Also, there was Star City. What are they called? Just Kaldheim Qualifier.
SCG Tour Online 5K Kaldheim Championship Qualifier, I believe is the full name, which I have to write a lot for my column. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, but still, certainly the place where the metagame has been shaped over the past few weeks has been in that tournament.
I miss it just being like SCG Indy, SCG Cincy. You know, like that was good times.
I like tying the events to the location. I always like that for the Pro Tours better as well. And I still call them that. Like, I don't call them by whatever set name they have attached to them. And maybe that's just me being a boomer, but I don't think I'll ever get over that.
I think that they've been punished by switching it up a bunch. I think if they just stuck with one and ran with it, it would have been fine. Like if we were still calling it like PT Kaldheim or whatever, then
maybe it would have caught on by now.
It probably would have stuck. But I'm in the same boat as you, where it's like, it's funny because I could say like, you know, PT Nashville, and you'd be like, which one? Or I could say PT Amonkhet, and you'd be like, what city is that? And it's just like,
no good answer.
I know. Anyway, first standard challenge was won by Phil Hellmuth. Naya Fury. Is that what we're calling it? I saw a conversation in our Slack channel for Star City. I think they settled on just Naya Adventures.
Yeah, I've seen it called Naya Combo some places, Naya Adventures, Naya Fury, whatever you want. We know what we're talking about. Some version of an aggressive, Gruul-based beatdown deck that uses Showdown of the Skulls and has this weird little combo kill built into it as well.
So, Edgewall Innkeeper, 16 adventure creatures, 4 Showdown on the Scalds, 4 Goldspan Dragon, 21 land, some Sajiri Shelters to protect Goldspan Dragon, and then Unleash Fury and Kazul's Fury. If you have not seen this yet, Unleash Fury is a card I did not know existed because it's a core set uncommon. 1R instant, double the power of target creature until end of turn. So if you have Goldspan Dragon, a couple of these, that's a lot of damages. If you have an extra mana and a Kazul's Fury, you just get to become immense Temur Battle Rage, like combo kill people. Remember when I was talking about like the showdown decks that I was building?
Yes.
And
we spent a lot of time on these.
Yep. Wanted some reach. Mm-hmm. Wanted like a little bit of a combo finish. Well, this is probably the best one. This is pretty nice because Unleash Fury does a lot of damage with like Lovestruck Beast. It's not just Goldspan Dragon, but like obviously Goldspan Dragon is just a very easy enabler. And then, you know, Unleash Fury, Kazul's Fury with any of your big creatures is going to be a lot of damage. So you're also, you know, fighting people with Edgewall Innkeeper Showdown. You have some amount of interaction with Bone Crusher Giant. Like, this deck is nice.
In terms of just like accomplishing goals, this is the best deck in Standard. It does so many things so well. Like, you have the Edgewall Innkeeper package, which is this ridiculous source of card advantage. You have Showdown of the Scalds, which again, ridiculous source of card advantage. You have a beatdown plan, which is completely viable. Like, just play your 2-drop Shepherd of the Flock, have a Lovestruck Beast, attack. You've won the game. Congratulations. And then you have a combo kill on top of it. Like, really, what can't this deck do? And then let's talk removal too, because you have your 4 Bone Crusher Giant and 4 Giant Killer, which is just excellent right now. We talked about the Faceless Haven problem. Giant Killer does a great job of dealing with that. There's so many of these large bodies around. So this deck feels like it covers every conceivable basis. It even does like the old school start of the format stuff that I was trying to do with Goldspan Dragon Sajiri Shelter, where you just find yourself with an unkillable Goldspan Dragon. It's got that plan too. So I think this deck has so many ways it can attack you. The sideboard cards are all nice, very targeted, very specific. And yeah, this is where I start on this standard. I think this is now the best deck. And certainly mono red is in contention. Mono white is in contention at this moment. But to me, this is what is defining standard because it just does so many things. How do you account for this? Like you can account for one plan. Sure, you can take out their Goldspan Dragon, play a bunch of Soul Shatters or something like that, or, have a lot of instant speed removal so you can react to the Unleash Fury. That's fine. I think that's a great approach. But then you just get ground into dust by Edgewall, Innkeeper, Showdown of the Scalds, and Shepherd of the Flock. So you have to be able to compete on that axis as well. And if you just dirtle around trying to go bigger than them and do something like cast Ultimatum, well, either they can just kill you through flat out aggression, or they can take that moment where your shields are down and find a way to kill you with their combo kill. So I think this deck pressures on so many different axes, and it's so strong right now.
Yeah, a couple problems I see with this deck, though, is that you are locked in on a lot of card slots, so you don't have a lot of flexibility. Like, if you needed to get a bunch of removal in your deck, like say, I assume that mono red, mono white are problems for this, despite this deck beating mono red in the finals. They just seem like difficult matchups because you don't have a lot of ways to interact. But like, if you needed to make those sorts of adjustments, it's like maybe you could cut a Shepherd, maybe you could cut a Kazul's Fury or something, but it's going to be really difficult to actually change the deck from what it currently is. And I think that this is sort of a benefit where the sideboard cards are all hammers.
Yes.
Like Paulo's article this week on Star City talked about, kind of prepping for the MPL thing and how their sideboard had just like a bunch of stony silences effectively, where it's just like Archon of Absolution is pro-white Ghostly Prison with flying. So like the mono white aggro decks, basically it's so hard to beat, What's the Scalding Cauldron?
Scalding Cauldron
is the card that people are like, oh, I guess I have to play this now. Ox of Agonis against Rogues, Rolling Vortex against Ultimatum, Redain against like the big control decks, and then you have like Fire Prophecy as your cheaper interaction. But it's like it's actually good that whenever you sit down to play against any matchup, you're just like, well, I'm only boarding in 4 cards because you can't really afford to change up your deck comp that much.
Well, that's a good point. And I think that this reflects that in construction and does a good job of acknowledging like what it can do and what it can't do. And looking for these hammers like Archon of Absolution was probably a big part to this deck having success. It'll be interesting to see how things change when like white decks are conscious of that card. I said that I expected a downtrend in white decks, and I actually thought this Archon of Absolution slot might get reclaimed for some more cheap removal. That hasn't really played out. It seems like people are sticking to mono white, and I'm a little surprised, but at the same time, I get it. Like, it's an extremely explosive deck. It, again, plays on an axis that most opponents aren't prepared for. And I think the real thing that's driving all of this is that the Sultai deck is just dramatically overrepresented still. And a lot of that is muscle memory, I think, where people anticipate, oh, you found the Sultai deck, so you just get to play it forever. The Sultai deck is interesting. It's strong. It was great deck building, but we talked about it. It has some very real structural flaws and some very real ways it can be punished. And I would say the same thing for like all of the control decks in this format, the Esper Doom decks, the 4-color Doom decks, all of this stuff is exploitable in some way. So I think people playing that to the degree they are is opening windows for these other decks to have continued success. And probably what needs to happen is you need to get away from the control decks, people. Like they're just not working at this moment. And I am a little perplexed by the draw, but at the same time, I play a lot of stupid control decks and you can't talk me off of them a lot of the time. So do what you want to do, but I don't think it's the moment for control right now.
Yeah. The funny thing is like, this reminds me of like a Hearthstone deck or a Shadowverse deck where like you're beat down, you don't really run out of gas. Other people can go over the top of you, but maybe you find a way to get like Leroy and what's the Warlock like +4 card?
Oh, I'm too far removed from my Hearthstone experience to identify that one. Inner Demon?
No.
Unleash Fury? No, that's this card. I don't know. I'm not a guess.
Power Overwhelming? Is that it?
Maybe that's it. Is Inner Demon a real Hearthstone card, or did I make that up?
I don't know. Dude, power overwhelming. I haven't played Hearthstone in forever.
No, nice
card. But yeah, it's like creature gets +4/+4, it dies in end turn or something, or it dies next turn. But yeah, it just reminds me of that, where you're doing this beatdown thing, and then you just have like this burst combo finish, and that sort of thing hasn't really happened in Magic. I mean, like Embercleave is kind of that, but Embercleave is also, it doesn't have to be like a burst card, right? Where it's like, all right, yeah, I'll just make this attack. Embercleave makes it so you have no good blocks and you'll die over the course of like 2 turns. It's just like a powerful top end. But this is very much like an all-in, like, pump my thing, fling it at you sort of thing. And if it doesn't work out, you're probably dead.
Yep. No, but it makes sense, because if you didn't have something like that, you were dead anyway. So find ways to win these games. And because you have these robust engines installed in the deck, you can afford to have those kind of slots taken up by a combo kill like that, because you're seeing so many cards per game, which I continue to hate. And that's still the biggest gripe I have with this standard, is there's just too many cards in hand, in play. There's unlimited resources all the time. That's still what is bristling me at the moment. But you may as well take advantage of it, and this deck probably does it better than anyone else.
It's one of the things I hated about Hearthstone and Shadowverse 2, where like you didn't have lands, you just got a mana every turn, and especially
your end game is always a full grip and like infinite options, and just figuring out how to maximize that.
And especially in the case of Hearthstone, where you had the hero power too, it's just like even more of like, don't worry, if you run out of gas, something horrible has gone wrong, right?
Right. Yep.
And that's very much how these games are playing out. And if both players have a bunch of options and a bunch of card advantage and stuff like that, then you need to find a way to actually just kill them. And these Unleash Fury decks, people going back to Mono Red with Embercleave, it all tracks. It all makes sense. Everyone's got a bunch of options, so find the best way to just punch through and get the game over with.
Yeah.
Second place, Go Bairn, Mono Red, Snow. These decks are like mostly the same, like Annex, Bonecrusher Giant, Fervent Champion, Fireblade Charger, Rimrock Knight, Robber, Embercleave, and then some amount of Frostbite, Torbrand, Goldspan Dragon. This one has 1 Phoenix of Ash. Occasionally you see, since this one has 25 lands, sometimes you see like Shatter Skull Smashing or Spikefield Hazard or something. This one has Castle Embreth. I think that it's interesting that you can't play a bunch of those, where it's like Zendikar happens and you have these like really busted DFCs, but then they also make Faceless Haven. So it's like, all right, you gotta kind of make a commitment, So you get to play like 2 of those, and Go Baron opted for 2 Castle Embreth. I think that's pretty normal, but this is basically what you're gonna see.
Not a lot of notes on this one. I said my piece on red. I think this is a Faceless Haven deck first and foremost, and does a good job of building a little top end into the deck for Embercleave. It's like the Kazul's Fury, Unleash Fury of this deck, but you mentioned it can work over smaller turns as well. And I think that as long as Embercleave is a card in Standard, you will find some combination of red creatures to throw at your opponent and steal wins.
Yes. What was it, 2 weeks ago when I was talking about Gilded Cart and like mono red, no 1-drops?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that deck is good. So I'm basically just questioning whether or not the 1-drops are actually worth it, but I think that's for other folks to decide. I mean, it kind of works well with Faceless Haven, but also when you're playing like Bone Crusher, Goldspan Dragon, you're kind of just dealing them chunks of 4 anyway. So the chip damage isn't super huge, but you also kind of want to like empty your hand so that you can just spend your mana activating Havens. So like I get that, but it is definitely something to consider and try out for all those folks out there who want to, try something different.
Yeah, I like the shape of it. It is interesting the way these decks deal damage, though. And I was talking with someone about Klothys yesterday, and we were talking about how effective it is against mono red. And I think the answer is not very, just because of the way they do damage, like you said. I mean, I really like Klothys in like the older formats. Like I think it's super strong in Pioneer. It's strong in Modern against those style of red decks. I don't think it's strong here, where they're able to put together this burst damage. And that's generally how they win games. It's not about the chip. It's about just huge explosions. Yeah,
so people are like, oh, mono red, it's like Modern Burn, right? You want any life gain that you can get your hands on. And technically, they're both red decks or whatever, but this deck doesn't have any burn spells. It is relying on killing you with creatures, and just color shift everything to green.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
And you would, against mono green aggro, you're not like, oh, I want to Sidon Clothis to gain some life. It's just like, no, they're gonna be hitting you in like chunks of 4 and chunks of 8, and it's going to maybe buy you a turn, but it's not like Burn where eventually you just grind them out and they're top decking and they finally top deck a land instead of a spell, so you win. Just the games don't play out like that.
Wow, now that you said that, I'm looking through this deck and thinking about what percentage of this deck wouldn't make sense if this was green. I think it's actually very little. Like Bone Crusher Giant doesn't make sense. Frostbite doesn't make sense. And I think everything else you can probably make an argument that it fits green's color pie.
Yeah, like Torbran increasing color related damage, maybe not so much, but
yeah, but it also kind of works, right? Where like you enable, like maybe you have to do it in another fashion, but enabling bodies makes sense to me.
Yeah, what if Torbran was just like all of your creatures get +2/+0 or something,
Sure, like because think about how it works here, right? Like there is no, like you said, no burn spells.
Yeah, you have Frostbite. You have Frostbite, which matters, but this deck's only playing 2 copies. So yeah, I mean, this is basically like a Stompy deck. This is not a burn deck.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And I don't know how that should change, like either building this or reacting to it, but I am positive that has implications on how you're supposed to approach this deck. Maybe the least of it is just like, don't rely on life gain.
Yeah, I think you just treat this like you would mono white or mono green, where you just want a bunch of spot removal spells. Certainly instant speed stuff for Goldspan Dragon, Faceless Haven, the usual like ways to answer Embercleave or have instant speed removal to like brick their Embercleave when they go for it, stuff like that. It's like it all applies, and they have some ways to like deal you the last points of damage with like haste creatures or Fireblade Charger, Bone Crusher Giant. But like if you're at 3 or something, I would feel relatively safe against this deck, and that's not how you would normally be able to operate against red decks.
Right.
Third place, I believe I had trouble with this player's name before. El Yallo.
El Yallo works for me.
All right. Mono white. 4 Faceless Haven, obviously. 2 copies of Sentinel's Eyes. 3 Usher of the Fallen, which I think is probably correct, but still pains me very much. And yeah, Mollusk Skyclaves, Halvar, mono white, Redain's main deck. Love to see it.
I try not to toot our own horn so much these days. I used to be really into that. I'm less into it now, but I do feel like
you really called Sentinel's Eyes, didn't you? Yeah.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I do feel like a few weeks ago we did a show about Standard, and we were both like, red is starting to look really good, and maybe there's a white deck where you're just working really hard to go Maul into Halvar, and that's going to be enough. And then I feel like almost instantly after that, these 2 decks skyrocketed to the top of the format. And I'm not surprised. These cards are so powerful. I like the idea of Sentinel's Eyes pushing Halvar a little bit more. I think like I might lean to 4 copies where I'm going as far as playing Sentinel's Eyes because it is underpowered in a lot of ways. But I've also found a lot of spots where the sizing matters. I think sizing is important in this format. So the +1/+1 and even Vigilance, if you're playing a lot of aggressive mirrors, like all that stuff adds up.
You have to get through Lovestruck Beast. You get to outsize your stuff against Stomp and Frostbite to some degree. It's pretty good on Seasoned Hollowblade. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, like who cares? Like you put this aura on a thing, it's cheap, and then you can get it back later for very low opportunity cost. Like if you're not caught up in, oh, I need threat density or something like that, then I think that this card is more than fine. It's like maybe a card that I would have played 1 of, just to try it or whatever. But, people have tried it and they're like, no, it's like 2. Like 2 is completely fine. You don't want to draw 2 copies, but you want to draw 1 enough of the time. And I don't think that you're losing out all that much because you generally have things to do with your mana, especially since you have Faceless Haven.
Yeah, it's just strange because this is like the one deck in all of Standard that doesn't produce card advantage and is just basically reliant on here are my cards, hope they're good enough. And in those scenarios, having a card with a little bit of a lower ceiling concerns me. But a lot of that could just be like I haven't had to play with a deck like this in so long that I don't remember what it's supposed to feel like, because this deck is still really good. Like I'm not trying to trash it. It's just different than everything I've played, where I have limitless options. You will occasionally run out of cards here, and Sentinel's Eyes contributes to that. But like you said, use your mana elsewhere. Faceless Haven gets activated. Move some equipment around. You find homes for it, and the games don't go that long anyway with this deck. You're generally pretty good at closing out your opponent.
Yeah, you run out of cards, but you don't run out of stuff to do with your mana because you have all the equipment. Faceless Haven. This deck also plays a Castle Ardenvale.
Yeah.
There's things like Usher of the Fallen. So I don't think that it's bad that this deck doesn't have ways to use or to gain card advantage. Really, it doesn't. Like you don't. It's similar to like the Hearthstone Hero Power thing. It's like you very rarely run out of things to do with your mana. So it's basically like you have cards, you have things to do.
Yeah. Whatever. I don't want to harp on the same point. I just wish more decks were operating in this fashion, where they found things to do with their mana as opposed to just casting more spells.
Yes, I love mana sinks. Love them, especially like Maul of the Skyclaves is so good. It's not like overpowered, like busted card or anything, but it is very nice that you can play it for an immediate effect, and then even if your creature gets killed, it does something later on. It's going to be kind of far down the line, a few turns for sure, but it is a card that is powerful relatively early and scales well late game, still just completely reasonable. And that's kind of like the perfect Magic card to me.
This deck is really good at making what should be meaningless cards meaningful. I think that's one of its best traits.
Yes. Yeah, that is legit, because all of your crappy creatures get equipped. You have cards to pitch to Seasoned Hollowblade. Luminarch Aspirant pumps them up.
Yep.
So one of the things that is funny about this deck is that there's a Legion Angel main and then 3 in the sideboard, and that just speaks to like the lack of actual sideboard options, where it's like, yeah, if you draw the 1 Legion Angel, it's really good in certain matchups, but it's just like if you had good sideboard cards, there's no way in hell you'd be doing that.
I don't know. I mean, like if you need a source of card advantage, like you need somewhere to go just a little bit longer, this is probably the best way mono white can do that. Like this is how you add more staying power to your deck against a deck with a bunch of sweepers, or a deck that does have the capacity to actually grind you out. Legion Angel seems like one of the better options, actually.
It's good, but the fact that it doesn't come up very often because you're only playing the 1 copy is the thing where I'm just like, yeah, if you had better stuff to do, you would just not be doing this. I think there's an argument to be made for like, if you need that sort of effect, then maybe you play 2 main, 2 board. And I think that would be fine. But when you're only playing 1, you're just like, I don't really need this. It's just kind of nice to have. And I have the sideboard slots because they would just be like planes instead because, whatever.
So it's interesting, when Abe Corrigan played this deck, I think finished second in the SCG Tour Online and lost to a mirror in the finals. Abe had 4 Legion Angels in the sideboard and didn't play the 1 main. And I wonder if in the post-board setups where you get in these matchups, like I'm mentioning, the really grindy ones, I wonder if he went with a 2-2 split, because that's an interesting idea to me.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem worth it to me to only play 1, is mostly what I'm getting at. And the reason it is worth it here is because the other sideboard cards would be like, I've built these white decks before. Like, I know, like you struggle a lot of the time. There's, you're filling out giant killers. You have a 3rd copy of Redain, Glass
Get
Casket.
your 4 glass caskets in there. That's the starting point.
And then it's like, yeah, Drannith Magistrate is awesome. And especially with this Naya deck catching on, you could see a 4th copy of that. That'd be fine. But like Soul Guide Lanterns, like Rakdos isn't even very good, but it's like, the hell else am I going to play, man? I'll just play a bunch of Legion Angels. Who cares?
Yeah, I guess so.
Capricioso.
Close enough.
Naya Adventures Showdown combo kill is just Embercleave, no Furies, Kazanu Mammoth, Lovestruck Beast, etc.
A little dismissive of our guy Arnie Brokenbrow here.
What does this card do? Like I know the text on the card, but what does it do?
It's your Unleash Fury.
Is it though?
I don't know. That's the narrative I've been told. And I believe I read it. So I think this is Dom Harvey's deck. And I think when he displayed this technology, he was extremely dismissive of the Unleash Fury setup, being like, this is just better. I don't think I buy that. I do think haste is meaningful, and haste is pretty important in this format. So I like that. But I am
Haste
telling you,
haste off of Showdown is good. We came to that conclusion for sure.
yeah, but the Naya Adventures deck is very real with the pure combo kill, and you don't need to work this hard on like including this mediocre creature. Like you could just do the good version of this, and I think that's fine.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. Bullwinkle 6705. Naya Fury.
Almost card for card what we saw on the other list. So no notes. Couple run of fouls in the sideboard. Cool.
Tight. Yeah, Phoenix of Ash instead of Ox. A Crow in War, which is pretty good. Fourth Shelter instead of 21st Land, but otherwise the main deck is like the same. I guess this one only has 3 Fatal Passage, but whatever. But yeah, pretty much the same deck. Very, very successful. Sixth place, Telsa Cow. Want to call this Dimir Rogues, but no end of the story. Has 4 copies of Valky, Thieves Guild Enforcer, Soaring Thought Thief. Instead, playing 4 Behold the Multiverse and Saw It Coming. So lots of counter spells, less high on Ruin Crab into the story, and Valky as mostly just a disruptive element that also scales into Tybalt late.
Yeah, I think I like this. I think this approach is interesting. It feels more cognizant of there are actually people attacking me these days, and there are real beatdown decks, which Rogues didn't put up with for a long time. There was no real aggressive threat they ever had to contemplate. And I think going in this fashion and getting to a little bit leaner setup with a little bit more meaningful cards can pay some dividends in matchups like mono red, mono white, give you a chance as opposed to just being absolutely buried, which I think is where the Rogues archetype starts against those decks. I just don't think you're able to play an effective tempo game against a deck using a bunch of cheap creatures. So here you just load up on the cheap removal, 4 Heartless Act, 4 Drown in the Lock, 4 Blood Chief's Thirst, and using Behold the Multiverse as opposed to Into the Story makes sense when you're getting away from Ruin Crab because you can't afford to miss. Like that's the big thing here is you just can't afford to not have this card advantage source. And if for whatever reason your opponent's graveyard isn't stocked up, that's going to be game ending in a lot of spots, given how good these decks are at producing burst damage. And I'd even say that for like the Naya deck as well. You just don't want to leave your shields down all that often, and you can't afford to invest these blank resources because these decks are so multifaceted at this moment. So this is interesting to me. I like this rebuild. I like that you found a way to add a top end and still have access to Luris, which is really cool. You've even shored up against things like Rakdos a little bit. And granted, that's not my biggest concern right now, but there could be a metagame where that's important again.
Yeah. It's interesting to me where Ruin Crab is very polarizing. Like it enables your cards and is a good win condition against control and mid-range, but is pretty bad against aggro. Like it would die to just a Rimrock Knight a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And by getting rid of that, it's like, okay, well, maybe Into the Story is not as good anymore. Like that's why Ruin Crab was in the deck, was to enable Into the Story. It's like, well, Behold the Multiverse is not that much worse. And then it frees up slots for you to play more spot removal. And this deck is like kind of hedging too, because it also has 4 Sod coming. So it's like, wow, you have 12 spot removal spells against aggro, and you have 8 hard counter spells against things like Sultai. And then Valky, maybe not great against Sultai, but certainly able to, mess up the curve of any of these aggro decks, which is pretty nice. And like a lot of the things that Valky can transform into is pretty good. It's like pretty relevant, taking a Lovestruck Beast or a dragon and then eventually becoming that. So
I love making my Valky's Lovestruck Beast. That's kind of my favorite use for Valky, and it comes up over and over. And this is interesting to me. The card that it doesn't perplex me by his absence. I get it, but the card I love right now that I think more decks should be playing, even though there are a lot of decks playing it, Alrund's Epiphany. I want to know what Rogue setups look like with Alrund's Epiphany, and I get it doesn't quite line up. Like you don't have enough damage from the Rogues in most spots to just like end the game off your Epiphany, but I think you can find ways to make it work, and I think you can find ways to benefit from those bodies as well in the Rogue deck, and it just fits with so much flying aggression coming out. So I want to explore that as well. And I know at some point I'm going to also find a way to put Toski into this deck and do the squirrel thing and draw a bunch of cards with my evasive Rogues. And it's probably going to make it way, way worse than it should be. But I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I think Toski Epiphany is good. I don't think that you should play Toski with like Thieves Guild Enforcer.
I was thinking more Merfolk Wind Robber into like Saurian Thought Thief, but
That's about the same thing. They're both equally bad.
well, evasive. You want ways to make sure you're getting as many cards as possible off the Toski. At least that's been my approach to Toski. Like I try and go wide and I try and go into the air.
I get it, man. It's just
You just hate it. That's all.
yeah.
Okay.
Sorrento,
I kind of do too. When I was proposing it, I wasn't too into it, so I don't blame you.
I think Epiphany is good. I think there's very low opportunity cost, at least to playing one copy. You get to 7 mana, or if you foretell it early because you have some free mana, then it's a free spell that makes you 1/1s at the very least, and the high end is so huge.
Yeah.
Sorrento 04, 7th place. Sultai, Emergent Ultimatum. This one is Mystical Dispute Negate main deck, so being a little bit more cognizant of mirror matches, which I think is kind of where we were last week. But now you see like this top 8, there's just aggro everywhere, and
Yeah.
things like Mystical Dispute you just can't play in your main deck anymore.
It doesn't feel like the right time for it. I do like that this deck has taken some steps to get faster. Like things like Wolf Willowhaven feels like a step in the right direction. Like you have to be a little bit more rampy than you were previously to keep up with these aggro decks. But I still think you're playing from behind, and I just generally don't love this deck right now.
Same. 8th place, BCS 8995. Rakdos, splashing some Corvolds for some sacrifice synergies. Crone War, claim the Firstborn, Village Rites, couple copies of Kazul's Fury, and then you have like Corvold and Immersturm Predator and Wolfstrider to sacrifice their stuff. This one is like not going as hard on Croxa, only 2 copies of Croxa, and then 4 Skyclave Shade, 3 Valky instead of the Mire Triton type of stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, some Boomcrusher Giants. This is a deck that I've seen a lot of iterations of in a lot of places, and it's looked mediocre every time, but there's something here. It's close.
I really like the idea of adding Kazul's Fury to this deck. Like we talked about, you need to find ways to close games. You need those explosive one-turn kills, and this deck is finding some, but it's doing a worse job of it than the Naya deck. It has worse card advantage. The thing it does better is like manage large creatures, I would say, with things like the Crone War and Claim the Firstborn. You're able to extract a lot of damage from your opponent's threats, which I could see being beneficial, especially when we're talking about these low resource decks where they just don't have a ton of creatures. So you take their thing that's holding a Maul of the Skyclaves and sacrifice it. That's a really big get. You've done a large damage swing, and you've effectively curtailed a lot of their mana. You've controlled one of their few threats. So I like that in principle. I just don't know that there's enough favorable matchups for this deck right now that I'm really interested in doing this. It feels like a worse version of a few other decks in a lot of ways.
I like it in theory, but yeah, I don't think that it does anything particularly great. Just things like Skyclave Shade, it's like, yeah, you have some things that sacrifice stuff, but it's like, who's that card really good against? Like even Shadow's Verdict just tags it unless you have like a Woestrider in play to sack it or something. So I don't know. I think that you could build it to be an anti-beatdown deck if you wanted to, and you would still probably struggle there.
Yeah, that's a bad sign.
Yep. The other standard challenge that took place over the weekend was won by Snapcaster Bolt, and this is a deck that I absolutely love. It is an Obosh Temur deck that also has Edgewall Innkeeper. So again, 12 adventure creatures, Kazandu Mammoth, Goldspan Dragon, 26 land, 4 Alrund's Epiphany, 4 Saw It Coming, 2 Great Henge. So you get the Saw It Coming foretell combo with Goldspan Dragon to protect it, but you also have like some Time Walk Obosh shenanigans. And yeah, 4 Alrund's Epiphany in a deck with a bunch of big creatures it's good. It is a winning strategy and a thing that I think is probably going to become more popular in the coming weeks.
Yeah, this is like kind of another version of the Naya deck where you have this almost combo kill built into some very, very robust card advantages. In this case, it's the Great Henge as opposed to Showdown of the Scalds, but a lot of the beats are the same here, where Alrund's Epiphany gets to function as your combo card almost, where you just kill your opponent out of nowhere. You're still doing the Goldspan Dragon stuff, still have the default beatdown plans that work absolutely fine. Brazen Borrower, a way to deal with some more problematic permanents, and then having access to the counter magic as opposed to something like the Naya deck. And if the Sultai decks set themselves up to have more ramp and get to their late game earlier, I could see them starting to give Naya some problems because they can outscale you. It's just that you have countermeasures to that and you're able to do it pretty effectively. But if they find a way to keep getting faster and faster, eventually it's going to become an arms race. And then I like getting back to this approach where you're able to just stop what they're trying to do flat out, what saw it coming, and then find your Alrund's Epiphany wins in the aftermath of that whole exchange. So a lot of appeal to this deck. And I also think they mostly all look like this at this moment, but there's a lot of ways to build this deck. You've been working on a list I know that I played a bunch and have been winning a lot with pretty easily. So I am optimistic that there are more ways to do this type of Alrund's Epiphany big threat stuff.
Yeah, I'm not gonna like advertise my list as being like super busted or anything. It was mostly just a kind of strategy that I like and kind of carrying it over from previous standard formats or whatever. It was, like Cobra Cultivate in an otherwise Izzet shell and just doing like some counterspell stuff and some ramp stuff and then topping out with Epiphany. But yeah, making sure that you have things like spot removal and Ugin to clean up these aggro decks, and you function like a tempo deck against any of the ramp decks and stuff like that. And it's like, it's successful. It might not be the best thing possible that you could be doing, but it definitely has a game plan against everyone.
And it scratches an itch for me that I just appreciate. It feels like it's kind of got that split up game plan where it's able to go multiple ways over the course of the game.
Yeah, and actually, I guess since I talked about stuff like this on the cast previously, where it's like, I wanted Alrund's Epiphany in a green deck, this is basically what I was envisioning. And I think that like Epiphany here with a pile of creatures makes sense, and certainly playing Edgewall Innkeeper makes a lot of sense. Pairing it with Cultivate was the thing that I was thinking about doing, so I just eventually built that deck. But we were also talking about like Toski Alrund's Epiphany setups and the best way to actually do that, and I think that's like another viable way that you could go. So a lot of options.
So I don't mind when we get a card wrong. Like I'm just fine with that. Like cards are tough to evaluate during preview season, and we're gonna miss. It's gonna happen. What I really get upset about is when I know a card is good, and for whatever reason, it still doesn't make my lists. And that's where I fall on Alrund's Epiphany. Where I just like, this does something important. I know it, and it's going to matter, but it's definitely not one of the top 10 cards. Like, why? Why wouldn't I have this on my top 10 list?
So my problem with it is that Alrund's Epiphany is very much a card where it's like, you need the format to be in a certain place, and you have to have like a good home for it and the right setup and everything. And those things weren't very clear at that point. So whenever I put a card like that on my top 10 list, it just like inevitably misses, where it's like, oh, the setup's not there. Like I had, Stitcher Supplier up there, and it's like, obviously that card is busted, but like it just didn't show up in standard decks for a very long time. So right. it's that sort of thing where I'm just like, okay, we should definitely talk about this card, but as far, maybe I'll put it in like the 10th kind of like honorable mention slot or something. But yeah, for the most part, I'm leaving those cards off the list because they're not slam dunks.
I think I've just come to the realization that if you get to untap with your Time Walk, it's almost impossible for it not to be a meaningful card in most standards. Like there's going to be a window for it to succeed, and it's just about finding that window. And this one wasted no time. And I anticipate all future Time Walks, calling it now, every Time Walk ever, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, you look at things like even, Part the Water Veil type stuff. It's like they showed up at some point.
Yeah.
They always did something. And this one it's interesting where it, creates bodies. It like contributes to actual aggression and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that this almost certainly should have been there, just because it's like, well, the odds that it doesn't hit is pretty low, but it's possible. So I don't know. I don't feel bad about like keeping it off just because I've been burned in similar situations, but
I just feel bad about everything all the time, basically.
Well, so. Yeah. I mean, never look back and like, count your wins. It's always looking back and counting your losses, right?
Correct. Although I did count a win on this show, so I'm doing both today. I'm glad.
You did, but you also pointed out how you hated to do stuff like that. So
that's true. No clean counting of wins, I guess.
Gaiba,
Gaiba.
GYBA. Second place, Mono Red, same list as the other one.
Yeah, some small sideboard differences, I think, but basically the same thing.
Yeah, main deck, 100%. HT991122, third place. Rakdos, actual Rakdos, no Corvold, but Sacrifice, Croxa, mashup.
Yeah, much harder on the Croxa setup here. Back to Timerit, Calls the Dead. Don't love this. I found some reasons to be okay with the other take on it. I am less okay with this. I think this deck has always been a very metagame dependent call, particularly a way to exploit rogues, and not a lot of other great matchups with this deck. And I especially feel that about the present standard. This gets outscaled by almost everything. Nobody's resource light, so Croxa has a hard time mattering. And a lot of the cards here just don't match up with other stuff that people are doing. So I don't love this one.
I like Croxa for the damages and the fact that it's big. Not necessarily I'm going to grind you out, but then there's stuff where it's like, oh, Brazen Borrower's getting a little bit more popular, and there's a lot of
Giant Killer.
Yeah.
Giant Killer is another one that I think is a huge problem. And I don't know, maybe you find a good matchup against Mono Red because you're able to make that big body reliably. But I also think like you do a lot of nothing in some spots, and yeah, you can find good cards here. Like there are things like Myra Triton gets points against red for sure. Rankle can do some damage against them. So maybe they found a good mono red matchup, and that's what this deck is mostly hanging its hat on right now. But I would need to see a lot more rogues in the format before I was thinking about this again.
There's a Necromentia in the sideboard, and I think that just as a rule, if you're in a spot where you feel like you must play Necromentia to compete,
don't play the deck.
Don't play the deck.
Yeah, kind of agree.
I get it though. Like the Sultai matchup's really bad, and there's only one copy because drawing two is bad. So like I understand wanting to play one. Like I guess I endorse that if you want to play Rakdos, but then at that point you just maybe reconsider things.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that Necromentioning them is going to have a huge impact in a lot of cases. That's the bigger problem, I think.
I think it's solid, but yeah, you still have problems with 80 card Seagate Restoration decks anyway. So
right.
Bilster 47, 19 snow-covered plains, 4 faceless havens. The rest of the cards don't matter.
Yeah, looks a lot like with the other lists we looked at. No notes. 4 Legion Angels in the sideboard, though, taking that approach. So
I don't get it.
I don't. It seems fine. I think you can go the 2-2 split after sideboarding.
Okay.
Matches where you really want it.
All right, check this out. 2 Clarion Spirit in the sideboard. Where are you bringing those in? Why are they not main deck if you decide that they're playable?
Where are you bringing those in? Where does a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying really matter?
I believe it would be good in mirror matches to block things with Maul.
Okay.
But at that point, it's like, I'm probably just play it main, or, you already have like some disenchants and glass caskets and stuff. Maybe Clarion Spirit is just not worth the slot.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time just quickly looking at this list, thinking of how my sideboard plan would work against the mirror. Like, are you getting really lean and cutting off some of your top end and then just bringing in a bunch of glass caskets, disenchants, and taking on almost control style role against them?
It's just another point towards you have no good sideboard options.
Okay,
fair enough. When that's a card that you're thinking about playing.
Yeah, maybe. I do like Clarion Spirit as a card.
I do too. Mazina Linda, 5th place. Naya Fury, same main deck, same sideboard as the one that won the first challenge as well.
Very interesting.
Carolmo, Dimir Rogues, classic, 3 of 1 mind, 3 Merfolk Wind Robber. That's how you know it's a deck from 3 months ago. 3 Crippling Fear in the sideboard, which was also in the Valky Rogues deck that we talked about. And it's like, okay, that card's kind of interesting. It does kill Seasoned Hallowblade, even with a Maul. Maybe not a Maul and a Sentinel's Eye, so taste it. But yeah, like the card is like a card that would just be a busted Magic card before, but not in a land of like Lovestruck Beast and Goldspan Dragon and stuff. So I'm not super high on it. I think if other people were high on it, they would just have it main deck. But it is cute that you get to keep your rogues and, maybe kill 2 creatures.
Yeah, these options always matter a little bit. What's the other one? Is that not in standard anymore? Witch's something? Witch's Haven? Is that that sounds like a land. That can't be it.
Witch's Vengeance with choose creature type. Those get minus.
Right. Is that still in standard?
It's in historic. I don't think it's in standard.
Okay.
Wombo Combo 2020 is disappointingly playing mono white and not the Fury deck. Sideboard options include 2 Funeral Longboat. This is just Abe's list, right?
I believe so, yes. 4 Legion Angels in the sideboard. That points me in that direction. Yeah, nothing really to report here. You got to love those Funeral Longboats making the cut, though.
So Longboat isn't bad. Like, I at least in the vein of you clearly have a plan with this. Against things like Sultai, Faceless Haven is an issue. Vehicles, similarly an issue. Does not die to the various sweepers, and their spot removal is taxed. This is a really bad version of that, though.
Yeah, I mean, vehicles have a very obvious strategic purpose. I think if you find a home for them, I wouldn't really care all that much about the stats. You just want it to be a certain cost. You want it to be easily crewable. This checks those boxes. It's funny. We used to have Smuggler's Copter in this spot, and boy, has this card downgraded dramatically from Smuggler's Copter.
This has Vigilance.
Oh, so it's better. You heard it here. Funeral Longboat, better than Smuggler's Copter.
I didn't say better. I just said it's not strictly better.
I heard better. I don't know.
It's like Smuggler's Copter was also like $10 at a point, and this will never be $10.
It's true. Cheap option always wins.
Lucas Dusick, 8th place. Mono red. This one has 4 Shatter Skull Smashing in addition to 20 lands. So getting a little greedy with the Faceless Havens, but I mean, Shatter Skull Smashing is good. I understand the appeal. It could be worth it.
Yeah. I think my take on the DFCs is always like, I want to use them to increase my land count, not really cheat on them. This feels like cheating. So that's my gripe. I wish there was a little bit more going on in terms of...
I would add 2 mountains to this deck for sure.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, then you can... And I mean, that also makes Shatter Skull Smashing better, right? Like now you're able to more reliably get to the mana threshold you want for it to be a really impactful spell. So if you want to go that route, no complaints whatsoever. As built right now, feels a little land-light.
Yeah, agreed. I do like 4 Frostbite. I don't understand why you wouldn't play 4 Frostbite.
Well, if you were making a read on the metagame that it was like a lot of Sultai, I think Frostbite's pretty medium there, but I think that would be a bad read right now. So I get what you're saying. Yep. Fair enough.
Yeah, sideboard, Oxyvagonus, Rolling Vortex, Soul Seer, Red Cap, Melee, Shredded Sails, Akron War, just, the 6 playable red cards.
All 6 of them.
There's like Phoenix of Ash, but, that's about it. Ooh, maybe new tech. Mono red needs to play 2 Funeral Longboat, or perhaps the Gilded Cart.
Right, you're a big Gilded Cart fan, I know. See if you can talk them into that one.
So even if I played mono red with no 1-drops, I don't think I would main deck Gilded Cart anymore because it's like pretty bad against other aggressive decks. Like I played it kind of as a Longboat against Sultai just because it smashed them,
Right.
But now I don't think you can. You can't really do that. I would just play like a bunch of Frostbites and a bunch of Shocks. Call it a day.
The cart will rise again. Don't worry. You'll have your moment.
It will. There's always time for cart. Game?
that can be game, I guess.
Good luck.